I've got this book and I'm leading these groups, weekly groups now, and I'm doing retreats. What should I be teaching? And he looked at me and he goes, raises one eye and he goes, teach them about compassion.
Welcome to Self-Made and Sober. I'm your host, Andrew Lassise with selfmade-coaching.com. And in this podcast, it's my job to interview people who are not only crushing it in business, but have also struggled with addiction in the past and are in long-term recovery. Be sure to join our Facebook group where we help entrepreneurs grow and scale their business at facebook.com/groups/SMC Mastermind, like Self-Made Coaching Mastermind. I hope you enjoy the show, and be sure to subscribe and rate the show afterwards so you can get notified each Friday when we put out a new episode. With me today is Darren Littlejohn. Darren's a best-selling author, retreat leader, certified yoga teacher, Reiki healing practitioner, and a recovering addict and practitioner of Zen and Tibetan Buddhism, as well as a former mental health specialist. He earned his BA in Psych in 1991 and worked in a chemical dependency and acute psychiatric care facilities during college. Darren took 2 years of graduate school in research methods for psychology. He's been involved with many community projects, including the fight against smoking, creating dog parks, community television, and a spiritually driven jazz program. What don't you do, Darren? It's quite the track sheet. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Hey, my pleasure. Thanks for asking me.
Definitely. So, Darren, why don't you give the listeners a little background on before you got sober? So what led to you finding 12-step recovery? What changed in your shifts and how you've incorporated all these cool ideas of Buddhism? And why don't you take us through that?
I grew up in Chicago and moved to California about fifth grade or so. And I got pretty awkward around fourth grade or so. And by awkward, I mean, I started having some real developmental problems, some real issues getting along socially, being able to have learning problems. And that stuff kind of all spiraled from fifth grade, sixth grade, seventh grade to the point where in eighth grade, somewhere between seventh and eighth, I discovered marijuana. And that was my next door neighbor was a hippie lady. She was growing it. So I grabbed some and, boom, like the lights went on or off, however you want to look at it. And I just said, oh my God, I cannot believe I didn't know that I was in a state of acute psychic pain and that I was, just about to teach my brain how to hijack the reward system and go into full-blown addiction. I just thought this was the best thing that ever happened. So I became very interested in drugs and alcohol to the extent that seventh grade was the last grade I completed. I actually could not go to school after that. I wound up bouncing around. I don't know. I used to say it was 9 schools in the San Jose, California area. I can't remember. I think it was a bunch. I went to these schools and they kept pushing me through to the next grade, even though I did nothing, even though I barely went to any classes. They just kept pushing me through until the point where I was in around 11th grade, standing outside of Willow Glen High School in California trying to sell some drugs. And I got arrested. I was trying to sell drugs on campus and the police chased me down and my brother bailed me out of juvie. I spent one night in juvie. That's my criminal history there.
Sounds hard.
I was just really fucked up, man. So I basically carried on this tragic sequence of events of just I'm not a successful guy, when it comes to that stuff. I don't know how to be cool and make money and get a lot of girls and be a dealer. But I saw these guys in the 80s doing this. They were driving Camaros and had hot girls and making a bunch of money. Hey, guess what? All those motherfuckers are in prison now.
At the time, they were cool, though.
Oh my God, they were the coolest. And I started shooting up with a guy. I don't know if everybody can relate, but a lot of us, have a guy that was like a mind fuck kind of guy who was kind of like really cool and everybody liked him. And I followed him around, this guy. Well, I'm glad I didn't follow him too far because he actually wound up going to prison too, but I wound up shooting up and being in East San Jose in the gnarly area with a guy that had a, quarter-sized black pus hole in his arm that he stuck a needle in, and then gave me the rest of my bag, which wasn't much, with the needle, and I just was going down so fast, and we didn't even know about AIDS back then, right? I mean, we didn't even know, but that was how you got it, right? And there wouldn't have been a better way to, or an easier way to get it. So I wound up, my dad had insurance and he sent me to a treatment center, and, I got sober in San Jose, October 19th, 1984. I drew a sober breath. I had a moment to reflect. They said something to me. Well, it wasn't your fault is what they said. You have a disease, it's a brain disorder. This is back then. I mean, they didn't have the science we have now. I had not conceived of any of this. I had never had a way to identify the problem. I was just a wreck. I was just spiraling. I was screaming and running down the street, screaming bloody murder, pounding on cars, getting in fights, being chased with guns by family members. I mean, just like this, I don't know. It wasn't anything cool or anything that you would want to put on a dramatic TV series. It was just a sad shit show, right? And when I got to the treatment center, there was a big sign as I waited outside the treatment center to walk in, which was really just a little shithole hospital. Like it was just not much, like a little office building, and they had this sign that said, "Through these doors pass the most beautiful people in the world." And I was like, "Oh, what the fuck is this?" This is not consistent with my personal identity. I just felt like I was the biggest piece of shit that ever walked the planet. And, I got sober and I started, doing things like they had yoga and something called like autogenics, some kind of little deep relaxation hypnosis thing, and cool meditation stuff, and jogging, and we did all these things. We ate food, and I hadn't had any food in a few days, and the other people knew like how I felt and had similar experiences. And this was all mind blowing to me. I latched onto this, and I remember sitting in the common area of that facility and looking at the 12 steps and 12 traditions on the wall there, because all the treatment centers were, and I think predominantly still are, 12-step based, right? So it said we had a spiritual awakening as the result of these steps. We saw through prayer and meditation. And I couldn't stop looking at those step 11 and 12. For those who aren't familiar, the 12 steps. And man, I really hooked into all that stuff. I started going to Saturday Night Live group, which was really the first big young people's group in California, maybe in the country. And really huge group, and just a tremendous amount of intriguing personalities. I got out of the treatment center and I went over to the across the street to the old high school. One of the high schools that I had gotten kicked out of had become a community center, and they made it into this room, what's now the now famous Room 47 for the Saturday Night Live group. We got a Facebook group. We have reunions, all this, because it was a magical time. I mean, it really was. I have never been able to recreate that in sobriety in over 34 years, right? Nobody else has either. There's something going on there. Like I went to a meeting, and it was a Friday night speakers meeting, and there was this old guy standing up, and he says, "My name is Fred, and I'm an alcoholic." And he says, I'm a foxy, gay, wino, alcoholic priest. And he was about 100 years old, Dr. Fred, you know. And I was like, oh my God, this is unbelievable. These people are like weirder than me. You know what I mean? And I was so hooked into that group and all the personalities. My name is Pablo Gomez Jr., and I too am an alcoholic. Everybody would say their thing, you know, their trip. And we would import these speakers from Clancy's Pacific group, you know, and they all, you know, Clancy had everybody go to Toastmasters. He had everybody train on how to tell the story and really tell the story so that you were captivated by the message of, and I just grew up on that stuff. It was unbelievable to me. It was mesmerizing. These people walked on water. They were spiritual giants. Well, no, they weren't. But to my heart and soul, as a 22-year-old addict who had crashed and burned and with mental, I didn't even know it, but I had mental illness. You know, I had trauma history, all this kind of stuff. So I was just completely enthralled with sobriety. And so I stayed sober for a decade. And I went through grad school in psychology. And right as the time I was about to finish my thesis in my master's program, I had been working as a market analyst. And I went to Texas, and I fell in love with Texas. And I thought I was going to go find my next mama for my son. I was a single parent at the time. I had the nice marriage, you know, where you meet the girl who's, you know, borderline personality, and you wind up and it blows up, and then I have the baby. So that,
one thing led to another, and now I have the baby. You can fill in the rest.
I have the baby. So I went to Texas. I wanted to go where Stevie Ray Vaughan was born and learn the blues. Like, I had bought a guitar from the neighbor's junk sale in the front yard, you know, for $20. And I had gone back into who I thought I felt I wanted to be. And I really moved away from being academic, and I just went into music, and I started playing, or trying to play and study jazz in Texas with these massively brilliant, intelligent artists, and just really immersing myself in the jazz scene. But I'm not a good jazz player. I'm not good at reading music. I didn't really do that well in it. I loved it, but I didn't really do that well. So I just wound up in a situation where I thought I would do what Bill Wilson did and pass it on. I thought I would go, because they treated alcoholics with LSD before it was illegal, and everybody was doing it. You can read the books on what was going on in the 50s. Everybody that you ever heard of, judges, senators, actors, everybody had acid parties, you know, before the FBI or whoever cracked down on it. So I thought, I'm going to do this, you know, I'm going to take acid. I've been practicing Zen for 10 years, and I've been in psychology, grad school, I've been in therapy. I'm going to really penetrate the deepest insights, right? So I took acid, and I sat there in my living room floor, and I had this deep penetrating insight that I was majorly depressed. And that just grew bigger and bigger and bigger. I wound up drinking, and I wound up going back into drugs and bouncing around. I wound up in Santa Cruz after a number of things happened. I would need a couple hours to tell that story. I wrote about it in the 12-Step Buddhist, more or less. But I wound up in Santa Cruz, and I wound up accidentally going to, again, I didn't want to go. I knew I'd never go. But I walked into a room, and it was a meeting. I said, what's going on here? And some little cutie said, oh, let's have a seat. And I was like, oh, fine. Okay. And that was December 4th, 1997. And, you know, coming back in, at the time, you know, Noah Levine had just come back from India long before he ever wrote anything. He was Buddhist. He had 10 years. I had just relapsed with 10 years. So I got with him to work my steps, and, you know, it was very difficult. It actually took me about 7 years or so to start to calm down and to stop screaming at meetings, and not screaming bloody murder, but I mean, just like being really loud and really kind of crazy. And a lot of people didn't want anything to do with me, but I got a nice girl that I met, and her and I actually wound up staying together for 17 years. And I went down the path again, and it wasn't very smooth, because there were reasons why I left the program, and it wasn't the bullshit, minimalizing, common, stupid things that everybody says constantly, which is like being in a groupthink cult. Well, I stopped going to meetings, and that's where. Well, I stopped praying, blah blah blah. Well, I stopped working with staff. Well, I stopped working with newcomers. I was doing all of that. And then, even in Texas, I was trying to do it, even where they talked about Jesus at the meetings and, whatever. And I was like, I don't know what happened. I tried to figure it out for a long time. So, well, now with my new awarenesses, my new work, I have a real clear understanding of what happened. And that's what I'm doing now. But yeah, so I've been sober 21 years now. I'm in my 22nd year. That's kind of what it was like, what happened, and what it's like now in terms of the recovery. But there was part of that journey which led into Buddhism and the 12-step Buddhist and the further things.
Thank you so much for sharing that with us. And I went through a big chunk of 12-step Buddhist, and one of the huge things you touched on very, very early in it that I'd love to dive into, even though some of our listeners, they may be earlier in recovery and this wouldn't apply to them so much. But one of the things that really hit me was the idea of the funnel that you talked about. Do you want to elaborate on that a bit? Because I thought that was, you described me to a T when you were describing the funnel. So I'd love to touch on that.
The funnel really is, and I'm glad that you reminded me of that, because I'm writing this new book, and I really need to make the funnel prominent, because my sponsor in Long Beach, where I went to college before I had relapsed, this guy, John P., he had said, the funnel, man, you're in the funnel, man. MF, he used to call me. MF, you're in the funnel, and I'm like, what are you talking about, John? He's like, look around you, so if you go to a speaker meeting, the funnel can be thought of as like, you go to the speaker meeting and there's like 1 million people at 30 days. There's a few at 60, a couple at 1 year, 2 at 5, 1 at 7, 1 at 11, 1 at 19, 1 at 32. Where'd everybody go? There's this big wide thing. The funnel is open and then it narrows down. All these people, where are all the people? Where are all the people, right? And the other way to think about the funnel is, besides the narrowing of the numbers, is hitting a black hole, hitting a dark spot, hitting a sober bottom, we would call it, in the rooms, right? Somewhere, and my sponsor used to say, in his experience, it was between 8 and 11 years sober or something like that. I think it can happen multiple times. It can happen anytime. I don't think it really happens in the same way to the people who have like the 3-year wonders who are like, what you really need to do is pray. Those guys who are sober a while, they've done their steps, they've had their transformation. There's a process that you go through in healing and in recovery that it takes a while for you to kind of settle into your bones and to start to feel who you really are. That is who you've always been prior to substance abuse, substance misuse, alcoholism, addiction, however you say it. So what happens to us, a lot of us, is that we fall into this pit of questioning. One of the big ones is why I didn't get sober to feel this way. Or why am I still acting like that? I'm 10 years sober. Then you have a double life, you're switching addictions, you're doing what have you, like one of the speakers, I knew the guys who knew the speakers and knew that, they married his sponsee. They have female men and women, sponsees in Southern California and a lot of places, which we never did in Northern California. But guy marries the sponsee. He was beating. It was domestic violence on his previous wife. Guys like 26 years sober, tells the most amazing story. What's going on behind the scenes? What's going on in the brains of people in recovery who are like, quote unquote, on the spiritual path, that wind up experiencing difficulties that are unmanageable and at times lead to, like I said, switching addictions, depression, financial and relationship problems, relapse, suicide, I got a lot of stories of guy with 12 years sober, Long Beach, shotgun, put a toe in the trigger, put the barrel in his mouth, 12 years sober, boom, done. Hit the funnel, man. How does that happen? And what's the answer? What's your AA sponsor going to tell you to do? So that's the funnel. And I fell into it with about 10 years sober. I came back. Then I fell into it again at 17 years sober.
Yeah, because part of the process when I had started this podcast a few months back, it was mainly going to be featuring only business owners, entrepreneurs, authors, speakers, things like that. And then when I niched down to what I really know in the recovery world, and it's been cool to meet people like yourself who it's just, I can't really think of any way that our paths would cross other than something like this, which has been really cool. But it was
people who normally would not mix, as we would say.
Yeah, exactly. But I was at a point, basically, it's like, I've got 6 years sober. I've got all of the things, multiple companies, wife, kid, house. I mean, there's a million things on the surface, and I'm pretty content and happy for the most part. But I think it's just that addict mentality of, well, what else is there? Like, am I actually peaking at 32 years old? So like any good addict, I'll put a whole other, let's start a podcast and try growing this as well. But I really, when I was reading that, it never really crossed my mind that you're absolutely right. I've been in rooms, giant rooms, when they have everybody stand up. There will be a ton of people in the first year, and 12-step recovery started 80 some years ago. So it's not like it's this new thing and they just haven't caught up to it yet. It's always like that, with the less than 1 years having severely outnumbered the ones ahead of it and the gaps in between them all.
And you want to know what else there is? The number that's really, really impressive to me is that in the past 25 years or 30, actually now it's more like 35 years. That's when I wrote the book in 2009. I said that the numbers for AA haven't changed really. They're hovered around 2 million worldwide. And I was doing some number crunching with the data from SAMHSA, which has to do with inpatient government treatment centers, how many people enter. And there was usually, and it's still actually around 22, 23 million people a year. That's just kind of one loose number. I mean, there's a lot more programs that aren't counted in that, and there's a little bit of recidivism, but there's 23 million people entering treatment a year. And the biggest treatment program that the biggest outpatient program that we can think of, it usually is AA or NA or what have you, and it has a couple million. NA doesn't give you any numbers really. So let's say it's double. Let's say AA and NA. Let's let's lump it all together and say there's 10 million. Let's say there's 15 million. Even let's just be super generous. Where's the other 10 million people? Where's the other 8 to 10 million people? So where are these people? Why is everybody relapsing? Why do they disappear? Do some of them wind up just not needing the 12-step rooms or not needing any more treatment, and they just go on in their happy way? Are they dying? There's not a lot of research to really track it. There's some, but the big point that I'm making is that we're missing something.
So tell us about the process behind what's going on when you first decided to write the 12-Step Buddhist.
Well, I read Dharma Punks, which had been my ex-sponsor's book. And I was like, it's not a very good book. At the time, I was like, it's not really that. I mean, a lot of people really like that, and it's been super big and impactful in a lot of people's lives, which is great. But at the time, I was like, it's not really a recovery book. It's more like a personal story. And I don't know. I said, it's not really that Buddhist. It doesn't really tell you that much about Buddhism. I had been really deeply involved with a variety of different types of Buddhist practice for a long time. And I thought, I need to tell a story here. I need to talk about some things like relapsing with long-term sobriety, like the funnel, things like different types of Buddhism that aren't covered in that one particular flavor. And, mental illness, what's it like to grow up having a kind of a manic disorder and this kind of stuff. So I wanted to and then I just felt like I started blogging for a while, and a bunch of people kept saying it was really good and they really enjoyed it. And I was a good writer and so forth. And my girlfriend actually gave me a book called How to Write Spiritual Books. And in the back of the book, there was a listing for agents. She gave that to me as like a birthday or Christmas present or something. I did what it said in that book, and I wrote up this proposal, and I sent it to the agent that was listed in the back. And she emailed me back and said, "Hey, you're onto something, but this thing is a mess. Here's what you got to do. Straighten it out." I did exactly what she said, sent it back to her. And she says, "Wow, you want to know what? This is pretty good, actually. I'll represent you." And she contacted Beyond Words Publishing, who had done The Secret, Cindy Black, who at the time was, she passed away, but she was really an innovator in publishing. And she told me, "Hey, look, Darren, we made a lot of money with The Secret, so now we can support people like you who have a message." So I had that opportunity and worked with the professional editing staff and fine-tuned the message, but I had no idea what I was doing. I just took my blog articles and some thoughts and some books and some meditations, and I kind of tried to organize this in a way. And because I have a lot in my head. I have a lot of thoughts, a lot of information. Maybe there's some knowledge in there rattling around. And it's hard for me to kind of get it in one place. So putting it into a book was really helpful. And I found it to be really helpful to kind of organize. Actually, if you want to learn something, write a book about it, because you really got to figure out what your thinking is. It's not just some bullshit that you think. It's like you've got to organize it, write it down, and get other people to read it and give you feedback. And anyways, that process has been super mentally healthy for me over the years. And over the past decade, more people have contacted me asking that same question that you've asked about the funnel and what happens. And I've got a really good line on why it happened with me and how we can deal with it and prevent it in the future with the next work. So, but yeah, the 12-step Buddhist, I never tried to make a program out of it or anything. I never tried to create, at the same time I was doing that, Noah did all of his books and his Against the Stream and his Refuge Recovery. And then that went out and became a really big movement and so forth. But I never really thought that Buddhism at the time should be a substitute. I didn't think that you needed to create a new program. I thought it would be easier if you just did what the principles talked about and try to integrate the different teachings from different types of traditions and so forth. It should be that you do choose your own higher power and that everybody's open to it. And there is no kind of fundamentalist, patriarchal, monotheistic, ram it down your throat, or we'll wait for you to finally get it the way we do, like kind of the way the language seems to be in the literature. So I feel like we should have just used what they really said you could do. And that's why I just did the 12-step Buddhist as sort of a supplement to, not a substitute for, is what I said in the book. That is not at all, the intention was not to ever have like another program that you'd go to. It was a way to understand what the principles of Buddhism were and what the commonalities were between Buddhism and the 12 steps, so that you could be comfortable in your own skin and just stay in your regular 12-step, which there's zillions of meetings everywhere and you already have a big community. Why go somewhere else? Why start something else? That was my view in 2008 when I wrote that.
I think it's really cool too. There were a lot of lines in the book that I know if someone were in a 12-step meeting and then they dropped some of the lines in the book, people would start clapping. "Oh, wow, you're so smart. You understand so much about so many different things." And I think it's a really cool concept that you're tying the two together and not doing like with Refuge Recovery, which I'm not super familiar with, but from what I understand, it's a completely different thing than the 12 steps. It is its own thing. Is that correct?
Yeah. Well, Noah, he was always really uncomfortable in it, and he was always Buddhist, and he always kind of wanted to be his own kind of guru. He really wanted to be a spiritual teacher since he was a kid. So he grew up around these guys and idolized them and so forth. And of course, some of them were weirdo cult leaders that wound up getting drummed out of town for strange accusations and things. But the point is that that's where he came from. He didn't want to try to stuff himself into the mentality. Where I came from was trying to integrate the principles. So that became a big foundation for me. But I wound up really kind of moving away over the past decade and doing a lot more yoga and a lot more of the spiritual practices that I've learned from my Tibetan masters and that sort of thing. So I moved into another phase, but the commonalities between the 12 steps and Buddhism are still there, and they're really strong. I mean, it's really simple if you look at it this way. The Buddhist of life is suffering, and that it's a cycle. Like there's a cycle, it's called samsara. There's like a hook. You go for the thing you want, you get the thing you think's going to fix you. You do a bunch of it, it backfires, and you wind up sick or upset or disillusioned, and then you have a period, and then you start ruminating, and then you do it again. This is a cycle of addiction, right? The cycle of addiction and the cycle of attachment, as Buddha would call it, are the same. It's just a spectrum. So on the low end of the problem, we have the cycle of attachment, which is the root of suffering, according to Buddha. And then attachment gone wild at the other end of the spectrum is addiction, full-blown addiction. So it's the same process. It just gets more severe and more intense over time. So if you understand attachment, you understand addiction. If you understand what Buddha taught, you can heal addiction. And if you understand addiction, then you sort of by default get Buddhism, because you're understanding that hooking into that craving and grasping and all that kind of stuff. So in that sense, that's still true. And it's very applicable. And you don't need to become a Buddhist to really get that. But if you want to be a Buddhist, you like to call yourself a Buddhist, you like to identify that way, you have all problems with different types of 12-step and so forth, you can go to something like Refuge. A lot of people love it. I know a bunch of people who love it. But the thing fell apart because of all the sex abuse allegations and the police investigations and the dissolving of the nonprofit against the stream, and now he's bringing it back, like just like we say, cease fighting everything and everyone, and just just keep fighting and proving you're right and digging your hole deeper is the way I look at it. But it's cool anyways, because you can do what you need to do in recovery. You can find a path of recovery for yourself, and if you like smart recovery and you like this one or that one, you can do it. But where all of this has left me is that the 12-step Buddhist laid a foundation and opened up a line of communication and thinking. I mean, I had hundreds and hundreds of people come to me over the years and say, well, my therapist gave me your book because I didn't want to go to, and they were always saying, it's like, well, it's an alternative. I never said it was an alternative, and I never wanted it to be that.
But kind of like a sneak it in there.
It's just a way to kind of be present and understand your own spirituality and your own suffering and not have to go to find another program. And even if you do have these other programs, there's not as many of them. Like I've gone to Al-Anon, the codependent, the people who are in a relationship with addicts and alcoholics. I've gone to Al-Anon over the years, and man, a lot of times I came up, and Al-Anon's been around almost as long. Sometimes I got to drive 20 miles and I go and the meeting's not there. It's like Al-Anon is long-term, and there's still not that many meetings. So it's harder to find a meeting, and even in things that are long-term like that. And when you get into these other splinter type groups or what have you, it's also just a little bit more effort. But maybe you find one and you got a niche and you go to it and it works for you. That's awesome. I totally support it.
Yeah, I think sometimes people kind of fall into the, 12 steps worked for me, therefore it works for everyone. And if you say otherwise, it's because you did it wrong and it's your fault. I feel like that's kind of the mentality of a lot of people in it. So I love that you bridge it together.
So that really speaks to the point, right? So I found out that, and I just did the 10-year anniversary of the 12-step Buddhist, and I went back through and I added some of my personal story, like how I fell into the funnel again, and how I didn't want to drink, but I wanted to die. And I spent 4 years, as my sponsor would have said, chewing the carpet, just like crazy, sobbing all the time, depressive, suicidal, just really, man. And this is after all the stuff I'd done, leading retreats and being a best-selling author and writing more books. I wrote a bunch of other books, up on Amazon and stuff. So I don't know. I just really got I made some bad decisions, and how did that happen? And so I talked about that in the updated edition and updated the brain science and introduced how this is really foundational, how it's changed a lot of lives. I mean, I've got thousands and thousands of people who've contacted me and told me that, oh, I've got 8 years sober now. I read your book in treatment. In fact, I was just at a conference in January, and the girl comes up to me and says, I've got 8 years sober, and I've been in treatment, and now she's a counselor, and she's got her own nonprofit recovery thing, and she leads speaker conferences and all this. And she was really happy to meet me. And I was like, wow, I helped change someone's life there with that book. So it's really been a stable and the update for people who still feel that, that they don't really want to go into something new, but they want to understand more about what Buddhism is about, and they like their 12-step, then it's a really, really good, solid companion guide. And it continues to sell. That book continues to sell just as well as it did in the first couple of years. So it's great, and it's updated, and that will be coming out in the fall. But what I did understand through some of my own research and the what I call the admonition of the guru. So I have a teacher, Lama Zopa Rinpoche, is a Tibetan master, and I met him in, I think, 2005 or so. And, you can find him he does Facebook Live teachings for like 10 hours straight. You could just tune in. There's a translator. There's somebody who's typing in all the transcriptions and everything. He's really a bodhisattva, really on the path, and just does nothing like the Dalai Lama, just does nothing but teach Dharma, and go all over the world and do it. Tens of thousands of students. Anyways, he had supported my first book, The 12-Step Buddhist. And I remember bringing him a copy to hand him because he had given me a quote for it and everything, and done blessings for it and everything like that. And I said, well, here, Rinpoche is what we call our Tibetan masters. I said, I've got this book, and I'm leading these groups, weekly groups now, and I'm doing retreats. What should I be teaching? And he looked at me, and he goes, raises one eye, and he goes, teach them about compassion. And that was like a decade ago, right? And I was like, okay, it kind of took a while for that to sink in, like years. And I obviously I work with it. I do a lot of podcasts on the 12-Step Buddhist podcast. I go through, and I'm doing the 37 practices of the Bodhisattva. I think I'm on around number 4 or 5 right now. So that's ongoing. But I had an epiphany with a guy who has a few years sober, a young guy, as I was sitting in a meeting every night for a year, dying. And I mean fucking dying. Like, I've never been in this much pain. When you're clean and sober and you feel the pain, and I did not get the solution. I did not get the connection. I did not get the support. I just basically sat there suffering. And I was sitting in a coffee shop with the guy, and we're kind of talking about that, and this thing hit me of what Lama Zopa had said about compassion and how it's really the basis of Buddhism. It's the basis of Buddhism. It's everything. It's all that Buddhism is, honestly, if you come down to it. And I said, you know what, Perry, I think we just created a new model for recovery. I have no idea what I'm talking about, no idea what that means, but I felt it intuitively. A little seed, I think they call it biju in Sanskrit. A little seed develops, and like the Bible says, mustard seed of faith, kind of a little bit. And that thing I spent a year or so writing and trying to come up with what I meant by that and what it was supposed to be. And I came across a bunch of really interesting stuff about adverse childhood experiences and trauma and its effect on, and by trauma, we mean experiences which cause the person to be shocked. And maybe it's one event, or maybe it's a long series of events. Maybe it's a lifetime of feeling unsafe as a child. Maybe it's chronic abuse. Maybe it's sexual abuse. Maybe you see your spouse or your parent, one spouse beating the other, or somebody goes to prison, or you have an alcoholic father who you hide under the bed when you hear the door open because you don't know if he's going to beat the shit out of you, or if you're going to get molested that night, or what? A lot of ways of thinking about trauma. It's not just the guy who's in the war and a bomb goes off and his buddies get blown up, because for one thing, his brain is developed already. He's already an adult when that happens. So when you're 3, 4, 5 years old and your mother just doesn't pay attention to you and you don't learn how to be a person, or when you're shamed, or when you're raped and you can't tell anybody, they tell you you're a liar, and they shame you when there's a priest molesting you, or whatever these things. There's so many stories. We all have them. I just did a survey on Facebook to try to get some stories from people for this new book. And man, it's like reading them is traumatizing. So I found out through study and reading, because I have this research background. I started reading a bunch of brain stuff and reading books and going to conferences and talking to clinicians. And I found out that there are these studies that are really solid, really long-term, and are really, really underutilized. Like the material's there, but we don't really use it. The truth is, if you look at this kind of data, trauma is about an 80% correlation to substance abuse. And when you take the substances away and or your processes, substance, a process, person, whatever your event, whatever your addiction style is, you take those away and you start to heal. If you don't deal with the underlying trauma, the underlying core of what caused that psychic pain, what caused that unrest, because there's a lot, and I'm going to talk a lot about this as I go in the future in the books, and I'm doing online trainings for all this and so forth. But the bottom line is that we get really, really hurt as really little people, and our brains don't develop right. And that layers on more and more layers of dysfunction that we don't even realize. We don't even know that we're missing this piece before this piece gets layered on. And we have more anxiety and more difficulty coping in social situations and more difficulty learning. And then your brain doesn't even really get fully developed until you're in your 20s. So it's hard to grow up as a traumatized person and not wind up depressed, suicidal, substance abuse, alcoholism. It's almost impossible, right? So what happens, you take it away and you start working steps. You can be abstinent and you can have sobriety and you can grow to a certain point. But what I found is that there's so many people that as I got to know those people that I thought walked on water over the years, I found out they didn't walk on water. I found out that they had shady business dealings. They had weird relationships. Even my sponsor, who was my ultimate guru, I mean, the guy was profound to me. Even on his deathbed, even in his last couple of years, he got really questionable in some of his thoughts and some of the things that he was doing. Not to disparage anyone, but it's just the process. What happens, even to the most diehard 12-step people. So trauma is at the root of it. And then I found out from taking my compassion studies to a couple of programs that I did. One's through Stanford's Compassion Institute, where you learn how to, they took all the ideas that I've been teaching and studying, practicing for years and years. They took all those into the laboratory and they said, okay, what happens when we do this kind of meditation? What happens to the brain? And then we stretch it out and we make it simple. We don't have it be Buddhist. We just have it be like, here's the principle, here's the practice. And they did this and they had this amazing, since 2012, this is from actually through the Dalai Lama's organization, to get this research going on what happens in the brain when you do contemplative practices. And John Kabat-Zinn started this over 30 years ago with his mindfulness stuff. But, all that stuff's gotten so watered down and diluted. And now Google's into mindfulness and like Facebook mindfulness and McMindfulness. McMindfulness is a brand. I mean, it's like everything's mindfulness, but really it's kind of pulled out of the context, the framework and the safety net of Buddhism and having a teacher and a sangha, a spiritual community. Anyways, there's a lot of practice that you can do. And what happens is that trauma changes your brain and breaks certain things. And then substance misuse, as we call it now, because abuse is shaming. So we call it misuse. And the shame core is at the root of trauma. My sense of self, my disorganized sense of self, my disassociated sense of self, my inability to stay within a window of tolerance between homeostasis and going into hypo or hyper arousal, like a manic-y kind of, to hypo arousal to a depressed. That window of tolerance can still be laid into my brain from when I was a child, right? So I'm sober and I'm still got this narrow window of tolerance. I can still So until I start to deal with, and you can't deal with the trauma with cognitive behavior. You can to a degree, and it is important to understand intellectually, but that's a top-down approach. So we talk about the bottom-up approach of dealing with trauma is getting into the somatic experience, getting into this felt sense, getting into the deep meditations, and yoga and breathing and Tai Chi and all these kinds of things that are movement-based. And this starts to integrate. So the problem with all of this is that it's not all in one place. And it's kind of like if you're lucky enough to find this book or go to that thing or whatever. So what I decided to do is create a new model for recovery. I've been researching it for a couple of years. It's called Compassionate Recovery. And you can see what I'm doing at compassionaterecovery.net. But the idea of it is that we have a program that's based on principles, not based on steps in a sequential order. It's based on compassion and self-compassion, which is really acceptance of self, but acceptance of self in a framework and with a roadmap, so that we can understand, here's the roadmap of attachment, what I call the spectrum of addiction, which I described earlier, really. And it's also the roadmap of recovery. So how can we go from early detox to wholeness, wellness, integrated sense of self, even spiritual realization at the end of that spectrum, and looking at that whole big picture as you start, and then being able to practice principles that are transferable skills that you can do in a treatment center. You can do in a treatment setting. You can do it in a facility. You can do it in a clinician's office. You can do it as a peer support person and have a meeting where you've done the mindfulness skill set, and you can do those trainings. It's not that much money. You get tested. We know that you're capable, but then you go, lead a meeting based on those skills where people can come from any addiction or not addiction. It's totally open and inclusive. It's not patriarchal. It's not monotheistic. We don't push higher power. We don't say he and thou shalt and none of that. It's there if you want it, but it's really wide open. So I started a group in Portland called 12-Step Sangha. I was going to call the book 12-Step Sangha at first, and I wound up calling it 12-Step Buddhist. And that group was like that. It was open. We didn't identify as addicts, open to anybody, had a long meditation, like 20 minutes, and then sharing. And the chairperson shared last. So by the time you got to the chairperson, you didn't have anything to say because it had all been covered, but he got to learn or she got to learn. And that group's still going. So I like that format, but there's a lot of ways of looking at the different formats. So basically what we're doing is integrating the brain, what we know about the brain in trauma, in addiction, and in contemplative practices, because you can heal the brain. But you don't really heal it if you don't really know what's going on. You want to heal it with intention and support. You got to have social support. So you got to have a group. You got to have professional services connected to it. You got to have facilities who understand this process. And there's slow movement in the field. There are these silos of information, but nobody's really woven it all together and said, hey, well, I've been doing this over 30 years. I've struggled and fallen, and I almost fell off the deep end again. So I've discovered what it is. I've discovered why I relapsed. It's that acute, deep psychic pain. How do I address that? How do I heal that? Teach them about compassion and self-compassion. Right? So how can we learn to heal?
Is this sort of your take on if someone doesn't want 12 steps whatsoever, they should look into compassionate recovery? Or is this also a supplement to the 12 steps, not a substitute? Which is it?
The way I look at it isn't either or, black and white. I thought I had an idea of, this is what the thing is when you write books, is that you think it's something. Even when you share at a meeting, have you ever shared at a meeting and the guy comes up to you afterwards, oh, I love what you said about hunting ducks. You're like, I never said anything about hunting ducks. What are you talking about? Like, I said it and you heard something completely different.
That's so funny. I've had that so often. I'll tell my story and someone will be like, yeah, you really, really hit on gratitude. You hit it over and over. And I was like, I consciously made an effort not to be cliche and hit on gratitude. So I know exactly what you're talking about.
So when you write books, it's the same way. Like you think you know what it is, but you don't know what it is until the people decide what it is. You know, like when people write music and they're like, They ask them, what do the lyrics mean? Whatever you think it means. So for me, it's like you can do compassionate recovery in addition to 12-step. You can do it instead of 12-step. Whatever works for you. Who comes, who winds up coming, and who winds up supporting it and being a part of it, will remain to be seen. My vision for it is that, these are open, inclusive, universal groups and trainings that people can continue to be educated and educate themselves and bring in the new information, because you don't have it in 12-step. I mean, my girlfriend was on the intergroup committees for years, like 10 years, where they would try to talk about changing the wording to be less sexist, and people insane in these arguments, frothing at the mouth over it. Like, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Well, it is broke, because people come in and they hear the sexist language and they hear what sounds like religious language to them, and they maybe they die because they don't get the where are there's 20 million people, so maybe it is important. So let's take all that out and let's operate on principle so that you can come in and, like, say, go into a mindfulness compassionate recovery meeting, or a forgiveness one, or a nonviolent communication one, or tapping, or neurofeedback, or a variety of different. So we're open to the skill sets, and we're open to the modalities, and we're open to the connection between the service providers and those modalities and the suffering person. And the suffering person, here's the big one. I don't have to identify as an addict. I can identify in a way that is mindful and open and aware of my condition of suffering. But I don't have to put a label on it, and I don't have to put the label of powerlessness on it, and I don't have to feel like a victim, and I don't have to feel broken.
It's an effective approach that can be used to solve these problems without the specificity of, well, I am in NA because narcotics are my problem. I'm in GA because gambling's my problem. And what the 12 steps they teach us ultimately is that was your symptom, and the real problem was you all along. And that's just kind of the gateway into it.
And they kind of leave it there. They kind of leave it there because the 12 steps they can, like, if you're lucky enough, and even if you are lucky enough, look, you can be a spiritual master, you can be a 12-step guru, you can be a lot of things. You can be a PhD psychotherapist at the top of your game in one area, and it really fucked up in other areas. We all know this. So we want to look at the whole problem, and we want to look at the whole solution, right? And if we can do this, then we're in a more fluid space. We're in a more creative, a more community, a more compassionate space. And this is really what I think the essence of spiritual teachings from all traditions is about, and what the essence of healing is about.
So what will these groups, will the structure be similar to a 12-step where just someone who's a member of it can start their own group, or will there be specific ways of here is how it's ordered?
I've got a couple of meeting formats and sample meditations. I think I've got 5 or 6 really lovely recorded meditations on these different topics up on the compassionaterecovery.net. That's just kind of a starting point. The way I see it is that, you can have a grassroots community meeting with no skills whatsoever. Just grab the format, follow the format. It's pretty simple. It's like the one I described. Play the meditation on your iPhone if you want, or read one, or read something else, or bring in a Jewish meditation, a Muslim meditation, whatever it is that is in your group, your culture, your part of the world. Maybe you're in someplace like South Africa or something, and you're not going to really want to read the big book. You want to have something that you can bring in. So it should be open that way so that anybody can do it. But there are some guidelines that we want to follow that are really healthy group guidelines that make sure that things kind of stay in check, like don't dominate the group and don't give advice and, things like that. And don't overshare with your details, and general way is really good in that. But then there's also, if it's available, if it's something that a person wants to do, is that you can do I've got a free training that I'm building, should be out really soon, on how to start a meeting. So you're going to go into the compassionaterecovery.net, go to the training section, you're going to walk through the training, and then it's going to show you things, and it's going to give you a question and answer, and then you can pass that test. It's totally free. And then you can really feel comfortable in that type of format, and then look at the areas where you can add to it. And in those areas, you can build skills. So then we're going to have more of trainings. Say I said mindfulness or compassion or something like this, and you want to learn a one skill or a set of 5 skills, for example, then you do that little training, and it's pretty short and pretty clear, but you do get a process and you do get checked, and you have to pass it so that you have the competency and the confidence, because you're not a teacher, you're not a guru, you're not a spiritual leader, you're not a therapist, unless you're a therapist. The idea is that a person can just learn a skill, and then that way they feel more competent to do the meeting and say, well, we're going to do this this is the mindfulness meeting, or we're on Tuesdays, we'll do mindfulness, or whenever the group wants to, we'll do self-compassion or what have you. So you can add skills if you want to. And then to make that even nicer, the clinician side, there's going to be a clinician's handbook so that the clinicians can bring their modalities like acceptance and commitment therapy, dialectic behavior therapy, somatic experiencing, all these kind of really important therapies that are well supported and researched, that deal with trauma, deal with addiction, and so forth. If you're already a clinician, you already have a treatment center, that kind of thing, you can bring in the compassionate recovery model and bring in some of your techniques in there. And then the clinician side, they have their own training because they start to understand all the compassion stuff and all the trauma stuff and so forth. And then they create this kind of foundation where a person can be introduced to recovery with those principles that are easily transferable, rather than, the managed 12-step approach where you go in and you do the Hazelden version of the 12 of the first 3 steps, and it's some like inventory. And then it's weird because you come out and you go to, and they're like, well, now you're going to do this real steps. Those are the paid ones, and it's like this, they try to have this, we're 12-step based, but it's not really, because 12 steps are free and it's written differently and it's very God oriented. So why don't we just have a
those don't count
and have that picture be open to research, open to, because with the compassionate recovery model, we're also going to, have the option to be open to research, so that you can go, before you go to a meeting, you can go on your phone and take a little quiz. And then after the meeting, and then after a while, that measures certain things in your life and ways that you operate, so that science can help recovery. Wow, what an idea.
Yeah, I've felt similarly that I know I'm the kind of person that just, they say, oh, well, do 12 steps and don't question why it works. Like you don't question why when you flip the light switch that the light bulb comes on, do you? You just accept it and just keep going about your day. And for me,
unless you're an electrical engineer, unless you go to college and learn the science behind electrons and circuits.
In wrapping up, so we just barely touched on, the amount of success that the 12-step Buddhist has had. Can you give any advice, any actionable advice for someone who, say, is a first-time author, maybe some mistakes to avoid or something that you'd double down on this next time through to have a better release or a better just performance? You can reach more people. Any actionable advice you have for listeners?
Well, I mean, anybody can publish anything now with Amazon, with Kindle platform. You can write stuff and put it out there. I mean, why not just write stuff and put it out there? You get paid a lot more from that percentage wise, but nobody really hears about it unless you put a bunch of money into marketing. And if you got a bunch of money to put into marketing and that sort of thing. So, I think if somebody, that's a completely different conversation. But if somebody wants to get started, you really have to get the writing done. Mm-hmm. You really have to get it on paper or the digital format. And without that, it's just a bunch of ideas spinning in your head. And no matter how organized you think your thinking is. And then when you have other people start to give you feedback, then you start to understand, is that what I was trying to say? I mean, the biggest thing about this whole process for me is that I have an attitude of Zen mind. I have beginner's mind. So the attitude is that I don't really know. I don't even know if I'm asking the right question, honestly. My sponsor used to point out the Snoopy cartoon where I think Lucy would say answers to life's problems, $1. And then Snoopy was sitting next to her saying, asking the right questions, free, or something like that. Whatever. The idea is you have to have an open mind and understand that you may not know what you think you know. And if you're open to the process of discovery, and spiritual influence, and trying to learn what you need to know about you and your path, and then how to help others. That's different than being intellectually proud and being like, I'm really smart and here's my idea, and it has to be this way. Don't be so rigid, and don't be so sure. That's my number one thing. Don't be so sure. Because like I said, even 12-Step Buddhist was like this. Some of my other books were like this, and Compassionate Recovery is definitely like, I don't really know. Like, I'm trying to understand. Let me read a bunch of stuff. Let me talk to a bunch of people and see what ideas come out. And then let's ask questions, and then let's see what other people think.
Awesome. Well, Darren, thank you so much for being on the show. I really appreciate it. We'll have links to all of your social media, to Compassionate Recovery, to your books. It'll all be in the show notes. If you liked the episode, please subscribe. We really appreciate it. And Darren, thanks again for coming on the show.
Peace out and namaste.
Namaste. Thank you so much for listening to Self-Made and Sober. Be sure to join our Facebook group at facebook.com/groups/SMC Mastermind, like Self-Made Coaching Mastermind. I hope you enjoyed the show, and be sure to subscribe and rate the show so you can get notified each Friday when we put out a new episode.